Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. There are some wonderful guests and some wonderful projects to learn about. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Explore Explain. My name's Andy Kirk and it's great to be back after a little bit of a break. And it's great to be back, especially with a special guest today, Valentina De Filippo. Hi, Valentina. Can you introduce yourself to the listeners and viewers, please?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Andy. So I'm Valentina De Filippo. I'm a design director based in London, and my favorite material to work with is data. I work across different formats. My work is very much sector agnostic, so it goes from theatre productions to digital application, books and editorial commissions. I've co-authored the infographic history of the world, and I also really enjoy spending some time training people in data visualization and sharing my perspective into how we can create effective stories with infographics or data visualizations.
Wonderful stuff. Very busy person. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your time today, Valentina. And one of the projects we're going to look at that you've worked on last year and sort of published towards the end of last year is a fascinating project, very much of the moment, and it's called London Under the Microscope. We're going to get really into the detail of this, but just to give people an overview, especially for the listeners who can't see the work, can you give people a sense of what this is about, what it looks like, and the form it takes, please?
Sure. So very briefly, London Under the Microscope is a data-driven film which narrates a year that nobody will ever forget, the first year of the pandemic, and specifically about London and Londoners. So the focus is really the city I live in. And it captured the first year with every second representing one day of the pandemic. And really, like, the main concept is reinventing the landscape of London and the geography of London through the morphology of the virus.
And I mean, I've already mentioned this to you before we start recording, but I think it's one of the most affecting, visceral projects I've ever encountered in the way it's been conceived visually, but also through the sonification aspect of it, which we'll get into the details
absolutely.
of in due course. But if we sort of step back to the starting point of all this and the origin of the work, this was a commission. How did that come about, and how did that land and arrive with you and your initial thoughts of the prospects?
Yeah, so this was a commission by the Museum of London, who was seeking to basically collect different type of artifacts from the mundane masks that we were using, or that we are still using actually during the pandemic, to the social distancing signs around London, to testimonies and letters and artworks that people were starting to generate around the pandemic, as well as digital pieces that they commission artists to do. And so this piece actually falls into this broader collection called Collecting COVID, organized by the Museum of London, aimed really for posterity. So imagine, like, in 10, 20 years, what would the audience of the museum want to know about the pandemic? How can we narrate this really crazy time to the next generation that didn't really experience what we did? So they approached me, was late February 2021, last year, with this kind of like a really open canvas, an open brief about we would like to work with you because of your expertise working with data. And obviously around the pandemic, there is so much data. How can we create something that is specific around London and how the pandemic has transformed London and affected Londoners? So a really open brief, but also kind of like daunting question of like, how can you possibly describe how the pandemic has transformed London and affected 9 million people? That was like the big task and the big question that I try to not really answer, but try to give form to, I suppose.
I mean, what's kind of fascinating there, as you've said, you've positioned it and they positioned it as a collection event almost, while it's still fresh in the memory, while we're still at the point in time, obviously still going through it and experiencing it. So as you said, it's not so much to answer a question, it's more to mark a point in time and remember all this so that, as you said, for posterity, for people in the future generations can then sort of feel what we felt. And I guess what this is, in contrast to some of the other COVID works that we've seen and some of the other COVID works that we've had in different episodes in this show, which were very much more about monitoring and seeing where things are going and the trends and the kind of statistical side of things. This is more about the feelings and the emotions, which we'll definitely explore later on. Just coming back to the notion of this as a commission, and obviously the people that come with that commission. In your experience, and I guess my experience as well, working with commissions can vary in terms of they tell you what they want you to make versus they say, make something for us. To what extent did they come at you with any ideas or any preconceived ideas of the form, the format of what this would look and feel like?
So yeah, as I mentioned, the brief was really open, but Fotini, the main commissioner or stakeholder, the digital curator of the museum, had a pretty clear idea what she wanted to include in the piece. So in the brief that they gave me in terms of like responding with a proposal, it was really clear that what they wanted was a focus on London, a focus on the virus, and a focus on the people. Those were the three layers. They were really detailed in terms of like, this is the story that we want to convey. It's not just about the virus, so the cases and the number of deaths. We really would like to talk about how those numbers are specific to London, as well as like Londoners. So how can we capture those people stories?
Yeah.
And what is specific about the pandemic is about, you know, like the two heroes of the victims, so the people suffering with COVID, and then the heroes. But then there are so many other stories, right? Of like people in isolation, people not being able to see family, you know, like long distance love and all sorts of stories, you know, denial. I don't believe that the pandemic is actually happening. I'm against all of these rules, you know, all of these kind of like points of view. So how do you capture that? And I suppose there was like a really direct brief in terms of like opening up the lens and the scope of the project, not just looking at the specific quantitative data that were available. So count of deaths, count of number of cases, hospitalization and all of that, but also really think about more broadly qualitative research that could paint the picture about people in these individual perspectives. So from the beginning, really the task was like, how can we capture quantitative data, but also this kind of like more qualitative and abstract, if you want, way of describing this time.
And we'll come on in due course to I guess the process that you went through and the relationship and dynamic that you have with the people on the British Museum side, so that you can get a sense of the process of evaluation and kind of check-in and approval and all that stuff. But just coming back to your side of the equation and the other cast and crew of people that you worked with, and we'll hear more about their roles in due course. But I guess from the outset, did you envisage this something that you would need to bring in other collaborators, or did you maybe start off thinking, I could, you know, tackle this alone and see how that goes on?
So yeah, that's a really good point. From the beginning, I kind of envisioned that my limited skill set would be a limit to the project because of just the kind of like amount of data that I had to basically pull together. And because I'm not a developer, I do not code. I kind of thought from the beginning that probably having somebody that was able to programmatically create something was more feasible than creating something manually, or with a software that is basically templated, because I knew that I wanted to create something that was not based on a template, which is most of my work actually is not based on a template or something that you might create on Tableau or, you know, PowerPoint PowerPoint or Flourish or any software that allows you to do data visualization. So in terms of like the key people, well, first of all, from the museum point of view, we had two curators, Fotini Haravani, that is the digital curator that got in touch with me at the beginning, but also Beatrice Belem. And they were like these really two key parties in terms of like soundboard and checking that, you know, the progress was making sense, that we were in line and in keeping with their vision, with the kind of like ambition of the project. But then from the beginning, based on the brief and the fact that the brief was already asking for a digital execution, so not something sculptural, not something physical or printed, but really something digital. When we started to explore what this digital manifestation could possibly be, it became really apparent that it wasn't actually something interactive, but rather an animation. So consider the kind of like implication of putting a digital application in a museum, whether it was within the time of social distancing, where only one person at a time could actually interact with it.
Yeah.
But also maybe in the future, thinking about how can you allow multiple people to actually see the piece and take it in. Actually, a movie allowed us for multiple interaction and multiple views rather than an interactive piece. Also, a point that was raised right at the beginning by Fotini was that a lot of like the digital archival that they have somehow becomes really hard to manage because of the future proof of the code. So even just the pieces they acquired maybe 10 years ago, right now they're not that easy to be exhibited or to be lended to other museums because of the type of technology or code that they were built on. So thinking about in 10 years time, a video, a .mov in terms of format is probably more future-proof than, you know, an application, even 20, 30 years.
Of course,
so so we thought about that as well.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, you can imagine looking back at 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Flash developments that would be, you know, expired or obsolete now. Yeah. Now, you've mentioned that this obviously is going to be something that could materialize as an exhibit in the future of any shape, size, setting. And I love that idea that it had to be something that could be experienced simultaneously by many people rather than something where, I don't know, like an interactive touchscreen where only one or two maybe people can interact with it at any given point.
Exactly.
And of course, with the idea of it being an exhibit, in a sense, the audience is literally anybody. And indeed, the subject matter touches everybody in different ways that you've already alluded to. So do you feel that in the absence of a defined, very sort of specific demographic that this would be for, that other works you've worked on in the past may come with, did that freedom help or did it hinder? Do you prefer to work with the sense of the persona or the constraint of this has to work for X, Y, and Z person?
No, I do like to know, of course, like who the work is going to reach, because I do believe that whenever we're visualizing data, we're trying to create a bridge of communication, right? Yeah. It's not just about a render, it's really about an act of communication. If you don't know where you're communicating to, it's hard to use the right tone of voice or to build the right bridge, right? To create a connection. So I do like to think about who is going to be in front of this piece, and I think there was enough there to kind of like describe, you know, this general person that in the future will come across this piece, but also even now, whether it was a Londoner or somebody actually coming from outside the city to visit London and the London Museum, I thought about the universality of the story. So despite the fact that we were looking at a very specific case study, so London, there is so much universality in this data set, in the data that I was visualizing, that can be abstracted and be interpreted based on our unique story, what was happening in our own country, in our own city, in our own life. Because even within London, everybody had a very unique story, right? What was the pandemic, what happened in this first year, the hardship that we had to deal with. So for me, was the very kind of, was the very kind of like idea of like this unique interpretation that had to be almost like formulated in front
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
data. So rather than creating answer with a piece, I wanted to create a space where you could find your own story, but possibly also be reminded that there were many other stories. So in a way, it was a way to journaling what was going on and to create a time capsule
Yeah.
that will allow you to find your story, but also to think broader than that and to be reminded, you know, there were people maybe less lucky than you or more lucky than you, depending on your own idea or story.
And again, I love that idea that it's to stimulate almost one's own interpretation, not to force an interpretation on people, because, as you said, we've all experienced different aspects of this pandemic. Now, just thinking about some of the practicalities of the project and the constraints that you may have worked with, because one of the reasons why we do this podcast and video series is to unearth those hidden barriers and obstacles that you face. But can you briefly touch on, I don't know, the dimensions of sort of timescales, any pressures that you brought to or had brought to you with the project, and just some of the routes that you had to navigate to optimize this work?
Yes, so in terms of like the brief itself, it came with a few restrictions, if you want, or limitation. The first one was the budget. It was kind of very small, as you can imagine. Like, it's a museum collection, is a broad initiative. They're collecting many pieces. So yeah, the bigger bucket, if you want, is divided across many different outputs. But the ambition was kind of big, right? Like, how can you describe what was happening in the pandemic or in London during the first year of the pandemic through data? It's kind of like a big piece. So I knew from the beginning that I had to kind of like reach out for help, both from a research point of view, but also from an execution point of view. I had 3 months in terms of execution. So the brief stated that from the beginning of March until end of May, possibly beginning of June, the piece needed to be completed, because then the summer was spent for reviewing all the pieces. And then there is actually a really lengthy process that goes into reviewing and in the acquisition from the museum point of view. Like, you get commission, you get paid, but your artwork can still be rejected somehow.
Right.
So this was fascinating to know. But anyway, 3 months, small budget, one person basically working on it, myself. So yeah, from the beginning, I kind of knew that I needed to reach out and build a team around this, and mostly like a team that had the same vision, the passion to work with this type of data and to create something that was meaningful for us, but also that could resonate with other people. So knowing that I wanted to create something like a video rather than interactive, I thought about Arpad Ray, actually the developer who worked with me on this project, because I was working with him at the time on a different project, on a commercial brief. And it was great in terms of creating WebGL framework.
Yeah.
So JavaScript, but very specifically WebGL, quick prototyping, great animation, quick to iterate as well. And I thought, Arpad, if you find this brief interesting, I would love to basically take this journey with you. And he loved the idea, so we started to collaborate and very quickly to start prototyping and move on pretty quickly with code. That would have not been possible with my initial idea of like, maybe I can do some stop motion frames and I can create every second, in Photoshop or whatever.
Right.
So that was absolutely the right call to do.
I mean,
And
going back to the
then later
timescales, sorry to interrupt, I was just wondering, when you first got that time frame clearly explained to you, did you look at that as like an overwhelming prospect to be able to turn it around in that time, or did you just sort of let it flow over you and think, well, that's the timescale, that'll be the timescale that I work to, and if it means that I'm limited in what I can do, then so be it? Because I guess people respond in different ways to deadlines.
Yeah. So 3 months was certainly like aggressive in terms of like creating all the research and the final output. But at the same time, it wasn't unrealistic. You know, like if they told me for weeks, I would have probably said, hang on a minute, this is not possible. We can create maybe one poster, you know, one visualization, but not a video. Within 3 months, I knew that I could create something that was bigger than just a static piece. Because I was working with ARPA, and very quickly responded saying, yes, I'm enthusiastic. I'm interested in collaborating. I also had the kind of like backup, let's say, I was more confident in taking on the commission because I knew that I was able to create a team also very quickly. Creating a team usually requires time, you know, like you need to find people that are available, that you can trust and don't let you down. But the fact that I was already working with ARPA and it was immediately available, build up confidence that I could actually start pretty quickly. And to be honest, having 3 months, so like a fixed deadline with a project like this is actually pretty good because you have a blank canvas in front of you, and it falls very much into this type of projects that is almost like a passion project, right? And you can spend all of your free time and you can really drag it on for months. Because with any personal project or self-initiated project, you're never fully satisfied with what you're making.
Exactly. Yeah.
So by knowing that you've got the constraint of actually delivering within 3 months, it's like, you know what, we're going to do our best, but then within 3 months, it's kind of done.
Yeah.
And that's I think actually worked out pretty well. I still have like a very long list of outstanding things
of
that
course,
I would like to do, but that's the what's happening with any project of this nature.
Save those for the next pandemic, eh?
Yes.
And I think what we'll do at this point for both the video viewers and the podcast listeners is we'll insert an extract of the video. So if you are listening to this on the podcast, you'll hear the sonification. Maybe check out the video that's linked to in the podcast as well. But for those watching on video, we'll play a little extract here so that people get a vibe before we move on to discuss it. So we've heard or we've seen an extract of the project there. Can you just speak to, again, we've talked about this open brief that you received and therefore endless possibilities of how you could tackle this. What were the original ideas? What came to mind when you first thought about this prospect and this project?
Yeah, so really thinking about these 3 layers of the virus, London and people, I thought, what if I could actually take the city of London and revisit it, reinvent it through the morphology of the virus? So pretty much from the beginning, my mood boards were based on these 2 ecosystems, the virus itself, which I believe is an incredible emblematic image, right? I think like since we saw the first render, maybe back at the beginning of 2020, where there were these like really shiny, really like perfectly looking.
It's a beautiful object, really.
Yeah, exactly. It became like a brand, no?
Yeah.
To the pandemic. It became like such a strong, recognizable image. So whenever we were thinking, at least I was thinking about the pandemic, I was thinking about the virus, and the image, right, came to mind. So I was thinking, what if I could use that as a way to create my encoding system? So whenever we're visualizing data, we engineer a system that can map out the data variables in a visual form. And the virus itself provided all these different variables of like the spikes and, you know, like the membrane and the different particles in the protein. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if then on the virus itself, we can see the cartography or the geography of London. So creating some sort of an abstract cartogram on the virus itself that reminds you of the geography. And that will allow me to tell the specific dynamics of London in terms of like the position, but also the time, how things have evolved. So that was really like the initial thought. And in the initial proposal, actually, with the museum, I've included some sketches and they were very much liked by the curators. And so I went with it. And to be honest, the final execution is not that far from the very initial sketch that they put down on paper.
And that's quite rare, actually. From my own experience, the ideas that you have initially sometimes get completely derailed by the reality of the data or the feedback that you get from other people. But it is nice to see that lineage from the ideas that you first sketched to the eventual piece, which is very consistent in style. I mean, did you avoid overthinking what else had been done about COVID in terms of analysis and stats? Because obviously this isn't the first visualization about the subject, but I sometimes find it very hard not to be aware of or cognizant of what others have done. And I don't want to almost pollute my ideas or over emulate what others have done, but still be on some level inspired and influenced. How did you sort of navigate that tightrope?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Andy. I think it was impossible to kind of like turn your eye away from it, because it was the way that I was navigating the complexity of the reality actually through data visualization. Like many people, you know, like on my Twitter feed, they were popping out the best data visualization examples I probably ever witnessed, you know, like from the FT work, the New York Times, The Economist. I was just like tracking the evolution of the reality around me through data visualization. And I was very much inspired by all of these examples. But I knew from the beginning that I wanted to stay really away from any sort of like journalistic or scientific report. Like you said at the beginning, the intention here is very different. Also, I wasn't working with experts per se, like in terms of actually trying to answer any question that we might have had about the reality with data. I'm not an expert. I'm not. I don't have the kind of knowledge. So I've used really data as a material to create and to kind of like almost create an experience that was for me this time capsule. And then I was hoping that other people could actually also find their own experience in this space, right? So the COVID data almost becomes like this wallpaper that is in the background, that is creating an image that, depending also on your kind of like data literacy or in your kind of like willingness perhaps to decode this complexity, you might find different layers, or you might just see something quite abstract moving in front of your eyes. But then I really wanted the story of like this time passing and these words and this journaling, the editorial kind of like data layer, the qualitative data layer, bringing the story to life. So it's almost like there is a background that is all the data heavy quantitative variables mapped into this like landscape or moving wallpaper. And then the foreground is all the words and the key numbers that or the key insights that are presented. And then of course there is all the kind of tension that is then brought to life with music and sonification, and with your own experience. You know, the layer that you bring into the piece is your own feelings and background and whatever you had experienced during this first year. So yeah, that's I think like what I try to create when I put together the idea. And of course it evolved. Because with the data research, I started to actually decide, you know, which pieces of data were going in, whether there were some pieces that were available, or I struggled to find consistency across all these different variables, because I had daily in terms of like the time dimension requirement. I also needed to have local authorities breakdown, because I wanted to map it across these different 32 local authorities that make up London. And not all of the data set was available daily or by local authority. So that requirement already started to filter down maybe the different variables that could add. The complexity itself, like once we started to prototype, was like, is it too much? Do we need to remove some layers? Does it make sense to actually add movement on the membrane? that you almost don't notice it, to show mobility, and then I decided to keep it in because it was just an extra layer. But you know, like all this decision kind of evolved, and something that was perhaps very clear from the beginning, like number of deaths and cases stay consistent. Other things I had to try, tested, eliminate, move on, as many projects kind of like evolved that way, right? Like try and test, see what works, and then you move on into the next decision.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, again, I'll touch on this in due course, but I do feel that the kind of the synthesis and the cohesion of the final piece is quite remarkable, given the number of different layers of data and details that are there. And as you said, you can experience it in almost two levels. You can either almost let it wash over you and just feel it as a single anatomy pulsing and moving and changing, or you can focus in on one aspect of it, but you can get a different thing out of it each time you watch it back, which is you know, brilliant as a video experience. Just before we get into the specifics of the kind of mapping of the variables and the visual and the sonification, going back to the question of data, you mentioned there about some of the, I guess, the little nuances of data and the availability by local authority or lack thereof. I'm interested in did you have any additional data that we don't see included that you were kind of tempted to try and find a way to squeeze in there? But also the non-quantitative data, the captions, the milestones. How did you source those, and how did you sort of navigate through how much of that stuff to get? And a little final branch of that before I end up asking you a million questions in one section is, did you at any point want to really humanize this and have individual people and faces or personalities, or did you want to kind of keep it almost as maybe at most a kind of anecdotal quotation level of humanity?
Yeah, again, all very good questions, and not easy to answer. So the first answer is directly to the more maybe quantitative data research. So yes, I had data sets that didn't include, for instance, like excess number of deaths.
Right.
I didn't decide to use it. I just used absolute numbers and then cumulative numbers to draw this kind of like background that changes the scene. Also had contextual data information that was painting what was happening in London. So like air quality, things like that could actually give us a sense of actually the city was transformed through COVID. I decided to then actually keep it pretty focused on COVID related data. I added mobility as kind of like an indicator of the fact that the city was closing with restriction, lockdown, and then opening up, people using public transport again on the membrane. But again, as I was saying before, it's kind of like a subtle layer, really the background. You might notice it, you might not, but really the key data points are the vaccines, number of cases, number of deaths. So yeah, I had like contextual data that I didn't use. In terms of like the qualitative and editorial research, that's where I really hit the wall. Honestly, I think that was the hardest part of this piece, was actually deciding what to leave out.
Right.
And I think it was not the first project where I had this kind of like realization that data visualization is not just about what you visualize, but often is about deciding what you don't visualize. But in this specific scenario, actually, I really felt the kind of like responsibility of capturing these 9 million stories. And I remember I had a block because it was impossible within these 365 seconds, so just over 7 minutes, representing 9 million stories. So you needed to have a caption on screen for a certain time. You needed to have them synchronized in a way with a timeline that didn't overlap too much, that you had enough time to actually move your eyes across the screen to navigate them. And although actually now it seems still quite loaded with information, there are only about 67 captions, and the
Okay.
beginning I had about 500.
Right. Wow.
And in these 500, I had quotes and remarks from notable people. So like, the WHO, for the first time actually alerting the world that we are in a pandemic time. The Boris briefing,
Yeah.
that we got really accustomed to news titles, the Queen's speech, things like that. I also had policy, so where new restrictions were coming into place. And actually, most of the things they actually noted were those policies, not new lockdown, new restriction, which step we are in terms of restrictions. I also had a layer of personal stories, and the personal story was actually based on my personal journal that I kept track of. And I thought that was actually a good way perhaps to add this maybe more human touch to the story. And at the beginning, I have to say I was really fond of that approach, and both the curators loved it. The moment that we actually started to see it on screen, it just screamed that wasn't right. It was not right to show that, I finally was able to hug my mom. And there was a big moment for me when I was actually visualizing that next to it. It just didn't feel appropriate to actually portray my own experience.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a way to narrate what was happening. So I thought actually touching too much on personal story was too much, because the situation was tragic.
It must have been really hard to determine yourself to have that almost discipline to say, actually, no, we can't do that, even though you are so invested in what that is about and what it means.
And it was so hard because actually I had two main stakeholders in the museum, and Fotini loved the idea of including my story, and I think that Beatrice at some point had the same doubt of like, maybe as a museum it's nice to have your point of view, your artistic view, and actually see your unfiltered self in this piece.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we see that actually with the work that you have created, the way that you have curated it. You don't need to spell out your story to be able to see your point of view, because it emerges. But yeah, there was a bit of like a tension there as well, because these two counterparties had a different opinion. But then I remember having a conversation with Fotini, and she was like, you know what, you're never going to be able to really capture 9 million perspectives. And perhaps saying less is better, because in this space that you're trying to create for people to recollect their own experience or retrace their own emotions and their own feelings, silence and this kind of like maybe abstract view of just like things that we are helping us anchoring our story to the past is better than maybe spelling out, like.
And that goes back to your purpose, I think, that you've expressed, which was to stimulate reflection, to stimulate remembrance more than to tell people what to think, in a way, which I guess is achieved by you removing that track of a personal story, but nevertheless is still a really hard thing to do, and actually really a hard thing for your stakeholder colleagues to tell you to maybe sort of think about removing from the work. But I mean, these are the struggles that I guess we'll have to go through when it is something that is a very personal piece of work. Now, obviously, there are tons more things we could discuss about the data and the work that you've done in the background, but I think it's time now to get into the details of this construct, of this actual visual representation layer, but then also this sonification. So we'll separate these out into two different components. So first of all, can you kind of walk through the mechanics and the anatomy of this bulging, pulsing, horrible thing that we see, showing lots and lots of layers of detail?
So yes, well, the first thing was to map out the geography of London on this kind of like spherical structure that is the virus, only on one face. So we actually see the 32 boroughs or local authorities on half of this spherical construction. Then if you're thinking about the physical structure of the virus, we've got the spikes, and those spikes are the representation of the cases. The spikes are actually made of concentric circles that they offset. So they actually lengthen in terms of like their position to create the spikes. And each day has a different area for these circles to identify how many cases there were on the specific day in the specific borough. But they all grow within the same length because we have got 365 days, right?
So
but
it's like lots of little cylinders piled on top of each other.
Exactly.
Yes, yeah.
Exactly, yep. And then from these spikes, we are seeing particles or proteins or whatever you want to define them. There are those dots, they're actually representing the number of deaths. Each dot or each particle represent one life, one lost life. And those spheres are popping in and out every day. So every day we have a representation of how many people died in each local authority. And they dissolve, and as they kind of like disappear, they create a cumulative count in the background. And it's basically almost like an X-ray or a sea that covers the landscape and transforms it, inverting the scene into black and white. And then we've got the vaccines. They're obviously happening later on in the video in December 2020. Hoping I'm getting it right.
Yeah, that's right.
Everything is kind of like starting to get a bit blurred with the timeline.
Yeah, what is time anyway?
2021. But yeah, the vaccines are represented as these kind of filaments that are growing around the spherical structure. One of the reasons for that is that the count of daily vaccine was not available actually by local authority, but just as aggregate for London. So they're not really anchored on a specific location, but rather they create a halo, a positive halo, I think, of what is actually like a good.
I never really thought about that, but it feels to me that constraint of the lack of data disaggregation helped there, because that effect of a halo, which is, you know, it has this sort of angelic quality of hope and radiating hope. I guess that came as a result of not having the data, but the result of it is perhaps a better quality than trying to fit something else into these borough polygons.
That's true. Probably like this is a good example of when a constraint actually becomes a good thing. And then what do we have? We've got mobility on the membrane. So we've got like a pattern that moves like little lines, and that represents how much public transport we were using over time and across the different boroughs. The more dense and quick it become, the more we were opening up, and the more we were using public transport, the more faint and really slow those lines are across the pattern, the more restrictions were in place, and the less we were moving. And there is also actually a heat map on the membrane itself that represents number of deaths per population. So normalized number of deaths. That's again like quite a subtle device or a visual encoding, but it's there. And the heat map is actually colored. So at the beginning, we start with a very kind of like muted color. And then it started to assume a more reddish, bloodish, if you want, color encoding, which is also then erased by the fact that the cumulative counting is transforming the scene into black and white. So you kind of like lose that, because instead of actually becoming this like really vibrant red, it becomes almost like a very intense white on black.
Yeah. I love that idea of almost the willingness to sacrifice that detail because there's a bigger picture kind of taking over the story as such. And as you've talked about there are some things that are very, very recognizable to the eye that are changing. So the death count, as you said, it pops in, pops out, it reemerges. And then there are some things that are sort of much more kind of gradual in background, like the mobility, but also like this kind of color transition that you mentioned, which I didn't actually realize that was a layer of detail until I paused the video and went back to a previous point and think, something's changed there.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that sort of comparison. But I like that you didn't feel a need to sort of point that out in a more explanatory sense. It was just something to be felt along the journey. There's also something that you talk about, which is this mutant, this variant story, this physical shaking, which again is very subtle at the point, but when you almost speed through the video, you see it happening. Was that something that you were thinking about any other method of showing it? Or was it just something that you'd have encoded as this shimmer, this kind of dither effect?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the project, I actually had a very different idea in mind. I thought there was going to be a halo around the timeline, where we could see all these different kind of like mutants and the percentage of cases related to each mutant, or number of deaths per mutant. So I don't know what we had exactly, but then actually seeing all the data visualized, and we went through layers. So in the prototyping approach, we actually started to encode and to engineer the data layers that we felt more strongly about. So cases, number of deaths were the first thing. And then we started to add and add and add and add. And then at a certain point, I just felt like there was just too much going on. So to represent those mutants is kind of like an interesting story, specifically for London, because a lot of these variants were actually found in London.
Of course, yeah.
I thought it's just a moment of like, what if I could actually highlight the passing of time, and also like how these mutants change in terms of like the majority of cases based on one specific specimen, with just a moment where everything shakes and changes. So we had this physical shake or deformation, right? The kind of like affects everything in the city. The spikes, that's how everything moves just for a few seconds. And then there is a label in the center that highlights the fact that, a new mutant is being detected. And now the majority of cases are actually part of that specimen.
I like how that it almost acts as a disturbance, like you've sort of shaken up the story. As you said, it's still COVID, just got a different name and flavor to it, but it's just like there's a whole new pathway, a whole new lineage that we're going to go through now, but it only needs to be almost momentarily, and then we kind of carry on with the story.
And it was a bit like that, isn't it? The way that we were informed about these variants, right? For a week, everybody was talking about the South African, and then the Delta, and then now it's Omicron. But it's almost like it's still COVID. It's still COVID-19. Maybe with this latest one, Omicron, things have actually become a bit more hopeful. But before, with these new variants, I just felt there was a moment of like, oh my God, things were actually starting to feel normal again, and a new variant is shaking up everything again.
That's right.
So maybe there was also the kind of like feeling that I wanted to imply with the shaking effect.
Yeah, I really like that. And I suppose that takes us on to the movement. I know you've obviously mentioned already that it's 1 second per day, but I guess there's always different decisions to make around animations in terms of speed and duration and the act of motion. Can you just speak to some of the decisions that you made, and perhaps again some of the mechanics of what we see? As I said, there's sort of the emerging of the death balloons, spikes, proteins. There's the shimmering effect. But at any point, did you think, actually, 365 seconds is too long? We need to maybe have half a second per day. People's attention will go. And not to put words in your mouth, was the change in story sufficient to keep people's attention grabbed throughout that process?
Yeah, again, all very good questions. And to answer the first part, is like, the emotion and the kind of like everything coming together and the decision that we took, I have to say, this was an incredible like teamwork. And I had the general kind of like creative direction and the creative kind of like vision for the
Yeah.
piece. But especially when it comes to the emotion and actually seeing the system coming to life, ARPAD added so much to this, you know, like it was amazing to actually see things coming to life with code very quickly. So I created some mock-ups from the beginning with mood boards and some kind of like mock-up of the visuals and the layout. But when it comes to the motion, it's actually with code that you refine a lot of these things.
Mm.
And I think the ARPAD actually did it all. I mean, there was a bit of feedback from my part to say, what if we synchronize the way that these particles are coming out? And we tried actually a few things. It's natural, you just want to explore and see how things will move, with different encoding system. But the motion side, all credits go to ARPAD.
Absolutely. And obviously, we can see in the panel piece that there are very clear decisions made about, a very sort of kind of smooth movement. It moves, it stays, and it goes down. And those effects don't happen through a default setting. They are conscious choices to feel what it looks like. And I think what I love about what you've described there is when we think about data viz projects, and especially that role of exploratory analysis where we're trying to get familiar with the data, for this, you almost needed to build a prototype to get familiar with it because of the movement and the living, breathing organism that you were creating. And there wasn't a way to shortcut that. As you said, you could do some motion capture sketches, you could conceive a storyboard, but until you build a thing, from there you have to make refinements, but you can't imagine or expect to see it without actually making it, which I think is an interesting sort of different dynamic to most projects that we do work on. And I think we therefore need to move on from the representation, the animation, to the sonification, because that is such an intense additional sensory layer to this piece. Now, I guess with it always been known as a video as an output, it gives the opportunity for sound, but were you always thinking it would also be sonified? So just for those who are not familiar, sonification is when you encode data through sound and different tonal changes, rhythm changes, pitch changes, but it doesn't mean to say you have to use it. At what point do you think, yes, let's have a sonification layer?
Yeah, so you were totally right with the kind of like notion that this piece was going to be an animated video. I knew the sound needed to be added in some sort of form. Knowing the budget and the kind of like time constraint, I wasn't quite confident that we were able to sonify the data, but it was certainly an ambition from the beginning. I would say like 4 weeks into the project, or maybe like halfway through the project, it really became apparent that we needed to start to see how sound was working with the visual. So the visual was starting to come to life. We had a prototype. We had more than a minute of everything working. So I decided to reach out to Duncan Gear. And I don't really know how to describe Duncan because he's one of those people, one of those unicorns that do everything.
He's got many,
he's a developer,
yeah.
He's a designer, he's a sound engineer. He's a writer. I mean, he does all sorts of things. I never actually worked with Duncan before, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to actually get to know him more. But I came across his work, of course, many times, and we spoke at events together. So of course, I was familiar with his work.
And we'll share a link to his podcast, Loud Numbers. Yeah.
Exactly. He works with Miriam Quick, who is also like one of my partners in crime in a different project, Auditivies. But yeah, I reached out to him and I was like, you know what, I've got this project is forming. Is lacking sound, is interesting. There is a great opportunity, but there is almost no budget. So just to be super upfront, I don't want to waste your time, but if you feel like this could be a portfolio piece for you to experiment, I would love to talk to you. He was very enthusiastic. and we started to work. And again, similarly with RPAD, I had a vision of what I wanted to create. I had my creative direction. I'm not though a sound engineer. And as you were mentioning rightly before, a lot of these things you just need to kind of like try it and test it and then work on it. And I have to say, like, all the sound benefit and the sound output that came out of this piece, all credits go to Duncan, because I basically planted a seed in his head and I just saw it flourish in a way that I could have possibly imagined. It's beautiful. And when I heard the track, I had some feedback, but it was totally bang on from the beginning. Like the first iteration that he created with this drone effect, I wasn't even able to articulate what I wanted. You know, I wanted something quite visceral, quite somber. I didn't want to have music per se, but rather sound.
Yeah.
That's what I basically convey in my description of what I had in mind. But I don't even have the vocabulary to really put together a sound.
But there is that
brief.
distinction between music and sound, obviously.
Yeah.
And, you know, it would be completely inappropriate to have some uplifting ukulele piece in the background, but also to find any somber music, again, wouldn't fit the vibe and the synthesis of what you have created. And again, in the background, we'll play at this point a sample of the audio to remind people what you hear. Can you just dissect the different components of what we are hearing and what maybe they are depicting?
So yeah, the first dimension that we have in the sonification is a heartbeat sound that brings to life this idea of like in a live ecosystem. So every second is marked with the passing of time and the heartbeat. Then the primary drone sound, that is kind of like a low droning sound, is the representation of the number of deaths.
Right.
The audio, the volume of the audio peaks during the waves of when we see the number of deaths increasing. Then we see the number of cases represented with other drone pitches, but they change in kind of like the pitch. They're higher,
okay.
They're not so low, and they also change with the different mutants.
Right.
And then, so there are kind of like two complementary drone sounds, one that is very low for the number of deaths and a higher one for the cases. The movement of the people is the baseline. So it's
Right.
a very low, kind of like monotone baseline that is marking the rhythm, if you want, of the piece, and is becoming more faster, more pacey when the city is opening up. And then towards the end of the animation, we have a positive sound that is actually representing the vaccines, and is becoming louder again with the cumulative count of the vaccine.
Okay. So it kind of almost drowns out the good, tries to compete with the bad almost in the same.
Exactly.
In the same. I mean, that's really interesting. And obviously with people listening and watching this who have got any notion of musical talent or skill, you know, the possibilities are so broad, which is why I do feel that sonification is far more than any sense of a gimmick or a passing fad. It's something that I do feel really powerfully encodes data. Again, you've got different notes, you've got pitch, you've got volume, you've got sustained versus more kind of rhythmic beats. And you've got different almost instruments. And one of the things that I feel when I mentioned earlier how this is very affecting is almost the suffocation and the intensity that you get from this sound. And I wondered, and of course this is something that Duncan kind of largely works on, but did you at any point have to reduce the sound or make things quieter because you felt it may have been too much, too powerful a layer of data?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there was a lot of like tweaking and refining, and the loudness was certainly like something that we had to consider. And again, kind of hard as well to kind of establish what is right, because depending on when it's played out, the kind of like setting, it could be quite different, the sound. And but again, like loudness is something that you can regulate in
of course.
when you play out the video. But certainly to kind of like making sure that everything was feeling right, capturing those moments of intensity and tragedy was very important. So yeah, there was a lot of like calibration needed in the piece.
Yeah, you're really correct about that. It not occurred to me before, but yes, the user, the viewer, or the exhibit, they can control the volume, but they can't change the pitch and the tone and the simultaneous notes being played. That's an interesting point there. Just to sort of wrap up the remaining elements of the sort of design anatomy of this work, you've spoken about the colour and the fact it's very somber, it's very restrained. The only, I guess, hue that you've introduced is this general redness, which I guess, were you hesitant to use too much red given its connotation to the subject?
Yeah, I think like from the beginning, the kind of like mood boards that I had in mind was almost like hand-drawn scientific visualization. So the work of Ernest Haeckel, I don't know if you guys are familiar with, but
Right.
it's fascinating. Is this zoologist, marine biologist, professor? They created really beautiful, outstanding work that was depicting nature and reality, and a lot of it is actually black and white. It's just pencil.
Right.
And I wanted to have this kind of quality of really like human-made artifact rather than a computer generated. So I didn't want to have something too shiny, too perfect. And the pencil on paper had the kind of like imperfection, if you want. So obviously the piece looks like computer generated and it doesn't quite look like it's a pencil drawing, but maybe the fact that I stayed away from lightning effects or color and the use of different colors as well, that was probably informed by this type of art direction and this type of mood boards that I was referencing.
And it does have that almost 18th century, 19th century vintage quality to it through the lack of, as you said, very polished, over simulated, over graphically engineered elements to it, but also the tonal quality of the colors as well, which is further enhanced by what you described earlier, this kind of X-ray inverting of the colors, which again feels that it's of a time that really kind of adds to the almost the otherworldliness of what we've gone through, I think, through this piece. And the remaining choices that you were faced with, apart from the composition on the screen of the objects, which we can pick up on as well, is, I guess, the decisions that you have to make about the extent of text and labeling and annotations, and I guess almost the apparatus that you feel you need to give people a sense of the numbers and the values and where we are time-wise. So can you sort of speak to kind of the decisions that you made around how much to include of that apparatus that we would obviously include in normal charts, but this is not a normal chart situation?
Yeah, this is probably the stuff that really ARPAD screamed the most, because I've moved the position of those things on the screen so many times. And of course, every time like ARPAD was like, okay, I hope this is the final version. And I would come up with it. Actually, I think I could do something a bit more clear by dividing the position on, let's say, the different category of the data. Anyway, to respond briefly to your question, the key element on the screen is the timeline at the bottom that really like walks you through the journey, right? So there is the passing of time is worked out. There are the lockdowns also like labeled. Then there are like captions appearing on the on screen, and they move around to kind of like almost represent what we were feeling during this first year of the pandemic, receiving all these bits of information from different sources, social media, the neighbors reporting the latest thing that they heard about. My mom on the phone telling me what was happening in Italy versus here.
WhatsApp groups,
all these different sources, right, of information. So I thought that's probably a good way to think about how we navigated this piece of information. And there are actually the different categories. So we've got data commentary in the center, negative data points on the left, positive on the right. So the right side is just filled with the vaccine stats. And then on the left, we've got deaths count, record-breaking data points and things like that. On the top, we've got quotes from notable people like the Queen, WHO, Boris Johnson, and so forth. On the bottom left, we've got policies. So lockdown is starting, new restriction putting in place, schools are closing, and so forth. And then on the right, we've got a counter of the total number of deaths. So there are actually many different moving parts, and they're actually literally moving. So I needed to make sure that when the final composition was created and the moving of these pieces was working, had to be synchronized in a way that made sense. So we didn't want to have 4 pieces of information at the same time because it's impossible to actually read them. That was part of the job of filtering out these 500 entries, of deciding which one to include and which one was to be excluded. The position of those elements, like you might wonder, why did they put the positive on the right and not on the left? And actually was not an arbitrary decision, but was dictated by the fact that on the right on the screen, I had the counter moving. And by having most of the information anchored to the left, this moving counter with the background, didn't interfere with too many pieces of information, but just one, the vaccine, was actually happening later on in the story. And then this is an information that actually was added later on after some user testing. So we shared this piece with family members and friends, and we collected some really valuable feedback. And one feedback was, at the beginning, we had a bit of a longer introduction that was introducing the encoding piece. So before actually going into the timeline, after the maybe the more story-based emotional introduction and the title screen, I had 15 seconds where I was introducing the different elements of the visualization, but 15 seconds, because of the way that the visualization works, were not enough to actually be remembered. So a few people said, I actually did not remember what the difference was between the bubbles appearing and the length of the spikes. So I decided to shorten the introduction, which was actually better for the length of the piece that already felt quite lengthy, and to have this mini key on the top right that is there.
It's permanent,
that is there consistently until we've got the vaccine that starts to interfere with the point of the screen, and I decided to then omit it. But it's there long enough to walk you through the journey. So you always have this kind of like quick help of like, how do I read this? And it's always there.
And I think when you think about the way that this could be experienced in the future, as you said, if it ends up as an exhibit in a gallery space or a museum space where people are kind of walking in, walking out, they won't necessarily see the full 6-7 minutes. They'll probably jump in, jump out. And so, you're right. I think the idea of having something that is relatively permanent throughout that process is important, rather than just giving all the instructions at the start and then saying, right, sit down and watch this. Now, you talked there about evaluations, and I suppose to wrap this up, there are several different aspects of evaluations. There's people who've used it, experienced it, the audience, and I know that you talked about road testing with a few people. There is the client, the commissioner, and you talked about this long process that they then go through once it's been made to ultimately kind of get it over the line. But then there's yourself and the people you work with. So if it's possible to summarize those different perspectives, what are some of the headline evaluations that you feel were most impactful on you as as the center creator of this?
I think everything has been helpful, hearing family, friends watching it, and people that are not really experts with data visualization was super, super valuable. Having a designer actually looking at this and giving me a kick in the butt, saying the typography wasn't that great, really was like, oh, Jesus, I really need to do a better job with this typographic treatment. It was a proper kick in the butt, yeah. The feedback from the curator also was really invaluable in the moment where I was really stuck of like, I don't know what to include, what to exclude, all this responsibility, and Fotini points of view of like, say less, and in this case would be more because you want to create the space, was amazing. Like I really needed to hear the feedback. Seeing the piece projected in a cinema screen in the Brighton Digital Festival was lovely, and seeing my daughter running around actually disturbing all the audience in front of the screen. I loved it, and actually seeing people faces and the reaction afterwards, that was amazing. And in terms of like working with the team and the feedback, as I said before, this was really the result of teamwork. So everybody added their own take and their own expertise to the piece, and I wouldn't have been able to create these without their help. So more than valuable.
Absolutely. And there are some generous acknowledgements and credits at the end of the video. And also we'll make sure that everyone is listed and pointed to in the episode posting as well. I mean, as I said before, I think it's an amazing piece of work and something that is so different to all the other things that we've experienced over the last couple of years, which have, as we said before, been very much more about monitoring and tracking this horrible last couple of years. So I can't thank you enough, Valentina, for the detail that you've shared today in this episode. It's testament to you and your colleagues that you've worked on, that you've pulled this together in such actually quite pressing circumstances as a piece of work. So thank you for sharing your insights, and thank you to everyone out there watching and listening to this episode. And we'll see you again soon in another episode of Explore Explain. See you soon. To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing, and spreading the word. See you next time.